you've transcended a liminal threshold into History Fuzz, a realm of contemplative inquiry in which leading researchers discuss the motivations, tools and skills of the skywatchers, surveyors, architects and builders who delineated monumental landscapes with awe-inspiring structures, enshrining their diverse cosmic chronicles in stone. I'm your host, Ashley Cowie. You can unlock videos, maps, articles, and enjoy early ad-free new episodes by becoming a member on historyfuzz.com, where you can also apply to join our team exploring and filming archaeology documentaries in the Andean highlands of Colombia. Having served almost 3 decades as an archaeologist, explorer and instructor, Dr. Edwin Barnhart, referred to herein as Ed, is director of the Maya Exploration Center, and he's the host of the long-standing ArchaeoEd podcast. As a distinguished fellow of the Explorers Club, Ed has published numerous papers and is featured in over a dozen documentaries about the astronomy and sacred architecture of ancient civilizations. Ed's aerial work in Northwestern Belize led to the discovery of the ancient city of Maxna, which is recognized as a significant achievement in classic Maya period research. He also directed the Palenque Mapping Project, a groundbreaking 3-year initiative documenting over 1,100 hitherto unknown Maya structures. In this episode, Ed explains that many of the associations presented between Maya temple architecture and the cycles of Venus are little more than figments of researchers' imaginations. And he replaces modern myths with facets of Maya cosmology and lunar astronomy. We also discuss Maya, Muisca, and Khmer reverence for the sun at its zenith, and how certain latitudes were made sacred and embroiled in complex calendrical rites and rituals. Enjoy this cosmic meandering with one of North America's most riveting and dynamic archaeological storytellers, Dr. Edwin Barnhart from the ArchaeoEd podcast.
Well, as you're well aware, South America is a huge subject, and there is so much population and civilization and depth of time. I'm a forever student.
Now, for the listeners, Ed has a podcast called ArchaeoEd, and I just listened to one of your episodes about you did a long-form deep dive on your own, questioning whether El Dorado was fact or fantasy.
I did indeed.
I need to tell you this. I live 22 kilometers from Laguna Guatavita in Colombia.
Oh, wow.
You disclosed your love for the fanged god, and you associated this fanged god with perhaps the goddess or the god that was worshipped in Guatavita. And I'm desperate to tell you this, and then I want to get your sort of take on this. It wasn't the fanged god and goddess there. It was a female earth goddess, Batchway, and a female lunar goddess known as Chia. And the big question is, why? El Tigre, the jaguar, the puma, stopped being an apex predator about the 9th century, 300 years before the rise of the Muiscas. And this is evident because cultural iconography stopped showing the jaguar god. And this is what I've got for you. So in areas in the Amazon where the jaguar still is the apex predator, that's why you see these carvings in the San Antonio Archaeological Park that show the shamanic transition between shaman and jaguar. So while you're getting a little bit overexcited talking about Guatavita, you're absolutely right. The second to the sun god himself was the manifestation of the jaguar god, but it stopped about the 9th century, just before the rise of Guatavita. What does that do for you talking about jaguar gods at the get-go?
So it's so interesting to hear about Guatavita and the different deities there and the transitions of what appears to be one religion into another. The you know, tracking this fanged deity, which has been my obsession for 25 years now. I'm always looking for how far it goes, where it stops, what does that mean, and so I'm excited to hear that Bhaktavita has something different, and perhaps we'll learn something from the change and why.
In some of the rural regions where the tiger or the cat remained as the predator, there's a character, you want to jot this down and research it, and his name is Tomagata. Tomagata. He ruled in a region known as Hunza. Tomagata, he was described as having the tail of a lizard and the head of a jaguar.
Huh.
This is a cultural mythological figure that's central in Moiska religion called Tomagata. And I think that's really unique because there's actually a full story about the rulership of this evil Kazaki called Tomagata.
Is it evil? Is it menacing them?
So, yeah, for sure, Tomagata represented social repression. Somewhere between the 9th and 11th centuries, it seems to be that rulers moved away from community towards ownership, supported by architecture and agricultural advances. The Tomagata, he represented the power of a mythological overlord represented by an emerald known as Goranchacha. And Goranchacha had a temple which still remains in the north today, and it's one of the only archaeoastronomical sites in Colombia is Goranchacha's temple. When a ruler died, all of the maidens, the virgins from the tribes, lay on the eastern hills facing the sunrise, and they opened their legs for weeks upon weeks to see who would be inseminated by Bochica, the sun god. Bochica, the sun god, made fertile one of the women who 9 months later gave birth to an emerald, a glowing green emerald.
Wow.
That emerald grew up and transformed into Goranchacha, this first social ruler who also ruled what was becoming an enormous religion where there's some temple, the Spaniards said it had more priests in residence than Mecca, estimated at 16,000 solar priests. The thing is, it's untouched, Ed. We go out in the mountains here and we're the first people we know that have been here since the time it was abandoned by these cultures pre-conquest. It's so unexplored. Anyway, I am so done with my own voice. I just really wanted to talk to you about that fanged god from the start because I've watched this episode of yours.
Well, I have a lot of follow-ups on that, but we will stay on target here. Let's have a conversation otherwise about all the knowledge you just dropped on me. That's that really I gotta process that for a little bit. That was great.
So let's come back to that because I need to get you to Mayans. I need to get you to Ed famously is the man who mapped Palenque for the first time. Correct me if I'm wrong in the pronunciation, but I need you to share with the audience somewhat of a part of the story that you told in that episode that you recorded because you turned, let's be honest, a mundane droning project into an epic hour-long story. Let's talk about this.
Oh, I love to do that on my podcast. Sometimes I'm talking about, just history, facts like the things you just said, and sometimes I just tell stories about my adventures in the jungle. And Palenque was definitely one of the good ones. I wasn't the first person to map it, but I am to date the person who made the most complete map. There were 100 years of maps before mine, but mine happened to include at least 1,100 more buildings than the next closest one. And it was 3 years in the jungle, uh, mapping with just what's now very rudimentary equipment, and 23,500 points of data collected over 3 years. So it's just kind of a point blanket that made the site. It was an exciting adventure.
When you talk about the point blanket, is that what my friend Walter Payne, he talks about point cloud imagery. He maps a site, but we don't have LiDAR, so we're restricted to what he calls point clouds. Is that what you're referring to, imagery?
Well, in a form, yes. What I'm saying, a point cloud is just basically, XYZ coordinates that you've collected in a cluster, and those together are a cloud or a blanket. And, I was using old school survey equipment, still laser theodolite, but I took one shot at a time. So it took us 3 years to get 23,500 points, where today's technology LiDAR gets, millions of points a second. So it would have covered what I covered in 3 years, much quicker.
What percentage of such a project is done before you even get on an airplane, Ed?
Oh, it depends on the site. Palenque was one where there was this rich body of information, multiple maps before me, people I could actually talk to who had been there to create the plan. In fact, when I first requested my grant from an institution called FAMC to do the map, they came back and said, you can't possibly do it in that little amount of time and for that little money. So ask us for 3 years and we'll give you more money and then you can do it. So, that in and of itself, my plan was expanded exponentially just by the grant panel who decided whether they'd fund my work. A lot of them had been in Palenque.
Ed, talking technically about the project, can you put into visual context what kind of resolution you rendered maps at? Perhaps how far in could I go before it becomes a square on my screen?
Oh, well, don't confuse what I did with aerial photography that has, a resolution. What I did is took a point cluster, put it into uh, survey software that made it into a 3D map, and then took that into AutoCAD and then carefully drew each one of the squares and rectangles over the points that I had taken. I had notes that said, these are the four corners of building L55. And so I would just go and, okay, that's exactly where L55 is.
Yeah.
And it's, in terms of resolution, you really can't look at my old map like that. But in terms of accuracy, I can boast that it is accurate to within a single building block. The most error I found and controlled was about 20 centimeters.
What an answer. 20 centimeters or the size of a building block. So my next question comes seamlessly from that. Over your analysis of the layout of the cities or of the villages in Mayan Mesoamerica, have you noticed any predominant orientations or alignments within structures that just jump out as being beyond coincidence?
I wish I could say yes and that it had something to do with archaeoastronomy, but I actually have to say no. A lot of the places that I have mapped or looked at the maps of are their orientations, at least in part, are a product of geographic circumscription. Just the rivers and the hills around them, kind of forcing them to be where they are. There are, you're a fan of archaeoastronomy. I obviously am too. And I have to say that a lot of my career in Mesoamerica, in terms of archaeoastronomy, has been a series of disproving things I read rather than supporting and proliferating them. And building alignments is one such. I mean, I started thinking there were so many buildings aligned to the equinoxes and the solstices, but the more you look at it, the actual examples are few and far between.
That is so refreshing. It seems to be when the archaeoastronomical researcher gets to a certain age or after a certain number of years studying it, where all of you began looking for accuracy and how close to a common meridian or a common alignment was this. But it's like when you become a master of your art, you start seeing the simplicity of it, and that perhaps the malalignments are just because people didn't do things accurately. You know something? I love that. The human aspect of that, rather than the odd lights out and seeing how close to the notch on the horizon it is. I think it was much simpler. But you must have seen cardinality underlying all of the temples or all of the sacred sites in Palenque. Surely.
Um, no, actually,
No.
I think that they are at about if I could put an average off the top of my head, I think that they are oriented about 19 degrees off east west.
Okay.
They're facing out to north. They're off by about 19 degrees on average. And I did put the orientation of every one of them, and it's on my Maya exploration website in my posted free dissertation. There is a huge chart of the orientations and dimensions of each and every building in Palenque. So we could actually run that statistical analysis, and I feel relatively confident it would come out around 19 degrees.
At this moment, I need you to give my audience that website, www.what?
MayaExploration.org. That's the nonprofit that I direct, and I have a lot of our research over the last 25 years posted there for free in the publications section. And it also promotes the various educational tours I run throughout the year, because that's, you know as well as I do, archaeology doesn't make any money. Somehow we got to make money to keep going in this field.
I totally agree. I'm going to haul you right back to your 19-degree tendency towards north.
Now that's just Palenque, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
In a place like the Khmer Empire, that is an empire and there is a unified situation, you tend to see, those are almost by rule cardinal direction orientated buildings. But the Maya, I think, in part because they are an independent set of city states and not an empire directing architectural narrative across the region, each one of them are kind of following their own thing. We see that in the building orientations. We also see that in hieroglyphic texts that talk about things like the moon cycle is a perfect example. There were Each one of the cities were making their own different calculations of exactly how long a moon cycle was, and they competed and went back and forth, and sometimes they convinced each other and sometimes they strayed away, and you can really see it throughout the different corpus of hieroglyphics, how they are having a debate on just how long the actual moon cycle is.
Do you see a recognition of that estimation in arts as they go from old to new, whereby perhaps they were a lot of indigenous cultures oriented towards the lunar maximum and the lunar minimum? Do you see tightening up in architecture towards such things?
I think there's a lot more of what you just mentioned, the lunar minimum and maximums, the 18.6 year cycle. I think there's a lot more of that in the Maya area than literature and my colleagues really see at the moment. We get so fixated on the positions of the planets. When you're a horizon-based astronomer, you've got the sun is the big flaming ball in the sky that you're tracking through an annual cycle, and it goes this far north and it goes this far south. The moon and the five visible planets will depart. They will still stay in that same band that the sun defines, but they can go about another 5 degrees off north or south. And that's what that 18.6 year cycle is. I'm preaching to the choir here, that. But my statement is that early archaeoastronomers like Avini, who's still around and still doing stuff, and many others focus on Venus and say, okay, there's, this has got to be a Venus cycle, but where Venus will be in its maximum north and where the moon will be is the same place. And same with the other 5 planets, where it's about 5 degrees, and the moon is such a larger diameter than the planets. I feel like we may be missing some of these lunar extremes that that are so visible in other places, like Chaco Canyon, like where you're at in the United Kingdom in general, and all over Ireland. That's a huge pattern through all of those areas. So, I actually had a discussion with Avini about it once, about why they say that the astronomical building called the Caracol in Chichen Itza, probably the most famous Maya observatory, that its staircase points to the maximum north set of Venus in its 8-year cycle. But I said, well, isn't that the same place that the moon goes? And he said, well, I don't know. It was Ivan Sprach who really said it should have been that. And I think it was about iconography around the building. And next time I went to Chichen Itza, I walked all around it. There's nothing that says Venus here. That's not it. So I wonder whether even something as supposedly known as that alignment isn't about the moon.
What you've just identified is what I would call an academic threshold, and here's why. It's not difficult to visualize the cycle of the sun and to be shown a chart with a circle going round a point. And it's also not hard to visualize this 8-year cycle of Venus because it represents a pentagram. These are very visual constructs that are easy to grasp. It's very, very hard to visualize the cycle of the moon or to actually learn it, because I find myself as an outsider interviewing archaeoastronomers, and when I take them to the threshold of the moon, where I start getting into minimums and maximums and the hierophanies, because what I see, Ed, is the sun was the ruler of the day, and the solstices, its extremes, were perhaps among the 3 most important alignments of indigenous cosmology and topography, including the equinoxes. But so too is the mistress of the night, the patron of darkness, the moon. And she governed the entirety of the Guatavita Southern Muisca Confederation. It was a lunar-based cosmology, and I know why. I live here. I plant corn. We plant potatoes. I live by the cycles of the moon, not because it has a mystical, energetic effect. Absolutely not. Why? Because it goes in blocks of 4 weeks. It's really easy to go, right, if I plant just now, it's 3 moon cycles minus 2 weeks. It's so easy and nice to work with. And when you've got the high altitude temperatures here, you can't work through the day. The Andean sun's too hot. Do you know what? See, 4:30 in the afternoon, I rub my hands and off I go with bags of energy. And if the moon's out, hey, I'll be working to 10 tonight under the moon. She's hard to strip from indigenous cosmology, but I call it the threshold where it's very hard to explain to someone.
I love what you just said. I love you. You clearly have some very out of the box research, which I love, and I do think that we don't pay enough attention to latitude. Certainly, my zenith passage studies are all about latitude. If you go from the bottom of England to the top of Scotland, the sun's angle from its farthest north to its farthest south, rising and setting, is different. And so, why wouldn't these ancient astronomers have been talking about that, having a conversation about it? They were travelers, they were careful observers of their natural environment, and they would have noticed that the moon and the sun are different here than they are there.
You know the diamond shape or lozenge shape carvings from the ancient world in Newgrange in Ireland, Maeshowe in Orkney, Neolithic chamber tombs built about 2800 BC. You see, diamond lozenges and spirals. Not every time, but often. The angle of the lozenge represents the angle of the solstice at that latitude, and you see it progressively getting more acute as it gets further north and then wider.
Really? Really? I did not know that. That's great. That's great.
Yeah, so get your solstice angle, have a look at the angles of your Maya and the ceramics, and look for that.
I'll tell you one we noticed a long time ago was in Palenque in the Temple of the Sun, which is all about the sun, and we've proved that there's tricks of light and shadow all through it in its orientation. The carving on the back wall shows Pakal and his son Kanbalam on either side of a shield, and behind the shield are two crossed spears. And the angle between the spears is the angle between the two solstices at that latitude.
If the line represents 1 degree of the circle of the carving, that's 1 in 360 chance of it occurring by luck. So that's a wonderful ancient expression of perhaps solar geometry, just solar geometry, classic, pure, and old.
And I like that approach too. We are detectives with a terribly small amount of clues to try to figure out anything about these people. And so things like statistical probability and the preponderance of evidence. Is there a repeated pattern, or is there a statistical improbability that that pattern would play out? Those are some of our most powerful tools to build an argument that we're not just seeing shapes in the clouds, that they actually intended to do this.
Okay, Ed, we've cracked the nut. Now I'm pulling you right back to where we were. Let's go back to your 19-degree malalignment from equinox. What is the angle of the zenith sunrise where you are? Because as you know, Magli in Cambodia, they've recently found zenith pits beneath the apexes of the temples. So important was the zenith. Do you think it's a zenith alignment?
Well, he was politely quoting my work in that.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Excuse me.
And I politely quoted his work. I love his work. But we're on either side of the planet. It's a funny thing. I've never met the man. He's in Italy, I'm in America, and we're both talking about Cambodia. I look forward to someday meeting him.
You just leave that with me for my second season, my friend.
Okay.
Just so you know, like I proposed a prime meridian that predates his earliest state prime meridian 2 years ago, and I was quite embarrassed because I'm not an archaeoastronomer, so I published on my website. And Bill Romaine, do you know Bill Romaine?
Bill Romaine, yeah. Oh yes. Yes. Bill's a good friend of mine.
So he's a great archaeoastronomer. Him and Professor Julio Magli made comment on this is a valid proposition. So since then, I've been emailing back and forth, and Bill's been looking at my paper there. But Julio agreed to come on and do a talk to me about that, and we started talking about this meridian. And the way I'm actually structuring this, Ed, is because you know them, is my interview with Julio at the start. He mentions the Chaco meridian. He said there's so many similarities between Mayan cosmovision rather than religion and Cambodian and Chaco. And he goes, there's so many current themes. So I thought immediately, I followed up all the other leads. But I need to, at this point, ask you, what were your own personal interests in the Khmer region? Which area are you interested in? And what was that you published several years ago?
Welcome to the club of people who are studying ancient Khmer astronomy. I think you might make 7 of us. There's almost nobody who's looking at this at all.
Well, my wife, when I told her what I'm doing in my podcast, she goes, "But Ash, is it sustainable?" And I went, "I don't think so. There's like 20 folk I can talk to about this in the world." And
Like, I'm always joking like that. Like, God dang it. Like, up to 375 people are going to be super excited about what we're talking about right here. And a proportion of them will know what we're talking about.
But mate, in 10 years' time, when artificial intelligence has got all this shit worked out with every alignment that was ever built, people are going to look back and go, those guys were barking up the right tree, off the wall as it sounded, because these things I think this is part of non-material history. I think there's inner and outer history. The outer stuff's the stuff we can touch, but the inner stuff's the motivations of rulers, their greeds, how horny they were in any given week. Religions got changed because of sex drives, and I think it's incredibly important to look at orientation and alignment, mythology and astronomy as a box, because if you don't enter that landscape of history, you're only getting a really superficial interpretation of the characters and gamesters that sit up in the top 1% of that profundity.
Okay, you asked me the question of how I ended up looking at Khmer stuff. Let me get back to that.
Yes, I need you to, because I didn't realize it was one of your research topics, and by goodness, we'll do this again. But I need you to tell me, because the audience have already heard Professor Magley's interpretation and deep dive into Khmer astronomy. Where do you lie?
Well, I had been studying along with a couple of colleagues the evidence for the Maya tracking zenith and its equal opposite nadir for 2 decades, and we had kind of run into a brick wall. We had written papers. There's lots of evidence. Other people are jumping on the bandwagon now, and I thought, well, are there any other cultures that are looking at zenith passage? And if so, what are they looking at? And what could it teach us and we can bring it back to our Maya studies? And so I looked around the world for places that would have zenith passage, which, as you know, is only in the tropics, only between 23 and a half north and 23 and a half south will we get a zenith passage, which means the sun going directly over our head and we cast no shadow. And strangely, or at the time, it was a surprise to me that most of the places that we consider the ancient world, ancient civilizations, are outside of the tropics. The one that was a total bullseye was the Khmer and Cambodia and Southeast Asia. So we went over there kind of not knowing what we would find. But we knew there were, a number of things we knew from the Maya and the Mesoamerican area that were the things we were looking for, which were basically zenith tubes, gnomons, and any kind of building orientation, and finally inscriptions that would tell us something. So that's what we were looking for.
Ed, can I ask you, did you, in your story, in your paper, were you the person that went on the zenith day for 2 or 3 days and found yourself on top of a hill? Was that you?
Yes, my paper on the importance of zenith passage at Angkor is all about us going exactly on the day. There are 2 days in Angkor. It's August 17th and April 26th. So I went into the temples I noticed days before, oh my God, every one of these temples have a hole in the roof that looks perfectly like a zenith tube. And at the base are these Yanni Linga complexes, and the Linga is a gnomon. It will, when the sun comes through the roof perfectly from the center of the sky, it will hit this straight up monument and it will cast no shadow. They've made both of them, and each one of the temples have them.
Oh.
So on the 17th, we proved it, and the nuns and the monks were so nice about it. I walked into one dark place in the Bayon where a nun was in a darkened interior part of the temple, and I said, "Are you ever in here?" And all of a sudden, the whole chamber lights up in light, and she was like, "Yeah, it happens sometimes." And I said, "Do you know what's going to happen in 15 minutes?" She was like, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll come back." And when I came back, she was all smiles and the sun was coming down. And she was like, "How did you know that?" I was like, "It's just astronomy. It's directly above us, only today."
Ed, what a wonderful place to take this. You said that's just astronomy. No, what that is a working example of how rulers of Khmer Cambodia maintained power over their people by knowing such things. So presenting astronomy as magic. We know when the chamber's going to light up, and you don't.
I'm going to disagree with you on that.
Cool. Why?
I'm going to disagree with you on that. We always talk about that the priests were so the astronomer priests were so absolutely essential to the agricultural cycle and all these things. I think it's the opposite.
Mm.
I think that every Joe, Maya, and Khmer knew about watching the sun and its cycles, and that the priests were not lording it over it; they were celebrating it as common knowledge that was absolutely key to their survival. And when they did those ceremonies, it wasn't about teaching ignorant farmers; it was about celebrating brilliant farmers, and what kept all of them in food.
That's magic. I love that. In one of the previous episodes, I myself discussed being in the garden outside, and if I need to know what time it is, I don't even need to see where the sun is in the valley. I just need to see the shadow on my shovel to know if it's about 3 or 4. And then I know where it is in the year with where the sun goes behind the mountain range to the west. So you're right. Everybody knew this cycle.
Every farmer knows that. The priests didn't tell him that. The priests were celebrating him knowing that.
In the Kami region, this adherence to cardinality and this extending of one ruler's key prime meridian. Essentially, what I'm trying to describe is what's defined as dynastic meridians, where the predecessor of a ruler extends his father's meridian. Do you see any evidences of that in the Mayan world, that dynastic growth of either meridians or astronomical centers?
In the Maya world.
Yeah, coming back to because they're contemporary.
Again, no, and it's because of the unique it's not unique, but the city state formation of the Maya. Their world was so dynamic. There was no Rome, there was no center, there was no empire. These were warring and sometimes allied city states that extended their knowledge, rejected the knowledge of others, and it was a maelstrom of these kinds of things where in terms of zenith passage is one thing that I can see, that they seem to be all talking about a certain latitude. Uh, we know that at the latitude, I think it's 14.8, but it's right, it goes right through Copan and a couple of other important Maya sites.
Yeah.
But right there, zenith does a funny thing where the solar year is 365 days. And between one zenith passage going up to summer solstice and to the next zenith passage is 105 days.
Yep.
Which leaves a remainder of 260 days, which is their sacred calendar.
Corn cycle.
And the corn cycle is 105, though I don't know whether, sometimes I wonder whether we're overstating that, again, because the Maya world's so vast. Yes, there are places where corn cycle is 105 days, but the difference of the corn cycles up into the mountains of Guatemala versus the plains of Yucatan are radically different. So it doesn't answer why everybody adopted the same calendar.
Brilliant.
Or maybe it does, because the weird thing about this zenith passage thing is I've seen it in multiple sites where there are building orientations that are not at that 14.8 latitude, but they're pointed at the day where the sun will rise and be zenith passage at that latitude. Palenque does it. Chichen Itza does it. Etzna does it. There's a couple of sites in Campeche that do it. And so they look to be, and Teotihuacan.
Mm.
There's a good argument to be made that Teotihuacan is orienting the entire site to the day when it will be zenith passage at 14.8, not at their latitude. So that's part of our zenith passage research, that we think that they are imprinting on a certain latitude zenith passage and honoring it in other places by recognizing when the sun rises right there, that means back there to the south, they're having zenith passage.
Wow. Okay, let's break that down. Your rejection of me trying to show off by saying corn cycle as soon as I heard 260 days.
That was brush. I apologize for that.
No, I love that, and I hope so too to the audience, because if two men can't just say when you're right, nice one, and you're talking shit, It's got to be that way, Ed. I think it's great because what you're inspiring me to do now is go, okay, so the idea that it represents the corn cycle is a step too far. And what you're suggesting is the zenith transit was why they did these things, not because it correlated with the corn cycle, but because the 105 and 260 days are representing the zenith passage.
Well, maybe I can explain my logic there a little more, or my
Yeah,
doubt.
do.
So we've got a latitude in which zenith passage divides the year into two groups of days: 260-day cycle and 105-degree cycle.
Yeah.
260 absolutely unarguably is the Zolkene calendar. 260 days was the first calendar in Mesoamerica. So no doubt they would have noticed that.
Yeah.
But the 105, perhaps it is, in the Copon Valley, you can get a corn crop in 105. But if you said you do a little farming, you know that just like when a baby's going to pop out of its mama, the corn is not going to be running 105 days every year. Ding or ding, 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 ding. The climate changes it. The elevation you're at in that latitude line changes it. So to say that 105 is an exact corn cycle, I think that any real farmer would spit on that.
Yeah. In that list that you just read out there, the greatest determinator for corn speed is what was planted in the field prior to the corn. If it was carrots, there's nothing left in the soil, but if it's potatoes, there's a lot of roots left in the soil, so they supply the potassium for the new corn roots. So you're absolutely right. And you can get farmers that have stunted fields and they grow a meter and just stop. And even after like 4,000 years of doing it, they're scratching their heads, not knowing what's stunted corn. And it's because underground rivers can be full of sulfur and heavy metals one year and then not the next. There's a lot of motion going on under the terrain here. But this idea of the zenith in Colombia, there's the oldest megalithic site is known as El Infernito, the little hell, as the Spanish called it. And it's 54 stones in a row, two of them parallel, center gnomon in the middle. And then there's four outliers. They identify the zenith, which is the zenith in Colombia occurs on the same week as the equinoxes.
Ah.
So
Well, that's the equator, right? I mean, right at the equator.
we're 4.5 degrees above the equator. So it's where it occurs here on, say, the 5th of April. It occurs there in Cambodia, which is slightly further north, 10 degrees, about 3 weeks later. Around the zenith, I'll be in the garden and I'll get a little panic because where's the shadow? And I'm looking up a bush maybe for the shadow to realize that it's just so slight on my training shoes. The sun is virtually above me.
That's a great example of what I think, would have dawned on people 2,000 years ago in the same place that you're living right now. A farmer would have freaked out that for a moment he didn't have any shadow and didn't know which way was which. And then he would have talked to his brother-in-law who lived 50 kilometers south and said, "Hey, you remember on the fourth day of the moon when you got no shadow?" He was like, "That did happen to me, but it happened to me on the seventh day of the moon." What? What the hell are you talking about? We can share the same equinox, we can share the same solstice, but zenith is different. Oh, that's weird. That must be important. That must be some hidden key to the mysteries of the universe. Let's talk about that. Let's make a gnomon and start investigating it.
And all experiential evidence lived by our forebears was all pointing to one big fact, which was this is a round thing you live on. They couldn't conceive that this is perhaps all one big round thing. Perceiving of your local territory is hard enough.
But it's funny how oftentimes New World cultures talk about the Earth not as a flat place, but as the back of a turtle or the back of a crocodile.
There you go.
It seems like a lot of the Native American things are perceiving a curvature. That's not to say they got the whole ball, but they're perceiving a curvature.
Yeah. Around the Andean world, especially in this area, the cosmovision described not the universe, but certainly earthly terrain as a disk, but it was bowled underneath, and around it, trimming it, is an anaconda, a black serpent. It goes by many names, and it's kind of it defines the horizon. Would you agree or disagree that perhaps one of the biggest motivators in the ancient world was questioning what lies beyond the horizon? The horizon as a concept where there be giants. It must have played such a significant part, the visible horizon, not only because the gods arise there, but because people came from there that changed things. What's your thoughts on the horizon in the Mayan world? Does the horizon appear in symbology or in artworks? Is it depicted or only in this orientation?
I think it is. I think it is, and I think that they see it as a sea out there, or a kind of a the dip off into water in every direction. They have they have the four directions that they spend a lot of time talking about today and in the ancient times, and then there's up and down. We Westerners tend to only have the compass, and we ignore up and down, but those directions were just as important to the Maya as were the four we call north, south, east, west.
Ed, I do this every episode. I'm sorry if I use an expletive that offends you, but what I'm going to say here um, brings us to the very threshold of new age bullshit.
Okay.
What you're talking about there, the up and down, is often described as the axis mundi,
Yeah.
where the horizontal plane meets the vertical plane. In Khmer, Cambodia, that would represent the cave of God, where the linga would be that you talked about,
Which is a model of Mount Meru.
the residence of the gods. What we're talking about here, the axis mundi, is actually the zenith alignment, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is. That's why I think they're paying attention to that. Things that go through the center of the sky are as important as things that rise from the east. Exactly.
This is magic. What you're doing is taking my focus from cardinality to east and west into a more vertical place where I'm considering that perhaps zenith was infinitely more important than east to west things that the sun and moon are doing, and perhaps that accounts for so many variables in the architecture of the ancient world that are currently unexplained, because we do have a tendency to think east and west and what's on the horizon. That's essentially what archaeoastronomy began as. And I think it's only work like yours that's shown this absolute importance of zenith passages.
Well, I will admit that it's still kind of confounds me that looking at definitely Maya astronomy, and frankly, we don't know enough about the methodology of ancient Khmer astronomy to say one or a way or another, but I believe that they are horizon-based astronomers. They are watching the rise and sets of objects and plotting them in an angular distance off of east west, because there's a band off of east and a band off of west. Are wanderers. The stars are the backdrop.
Yeah.
They're the stage. And then there's wanderers. There's the planets, the moon, and the sun, who do fun little dances on the starry stage. And those are in an angular cluster. That's the only places they'll go, off of east and off of west. And so they're watching them horizon based. But the Maya are telling us through their horizon based astronomy and orientations that on the day that the sun rises at this orientation, it will pass over our head. And so we've abundantly proven that in the Maya and Mesoamerica area. I went to Khmer to try to replicate that, and I find nothing but a world of cardinal direction temple complexes until Kokare shows up. And I had not seen any maps of Kokare. Uh, Giulio Magli is the one who I saw his publication from a Japanese project. He said there are almost everything is cardinal directions except for these two weird sites, and one of them's Kokare, and I think it's the Zenith Passage. And so I was like, oh my God, he's right about that.
Mhm.
And the only thing I did to further his work, and that's when that's the world of scholarship I want to live in, where some scholar says something significant, and another scholar picks up and runs with it, and we both talk about each other and thank each other for the moment. But I went to Kokere.
Yeah.
I've been there for the last 2 summers, standing on top of the pyramid and taking pictures of this zenith alignment. Now, uh, Julio's the one who saw it first, but I actually saw it.
Mm-hmm.
He recognized it was probably there. But again, you're an archaeoastronomer, so you know that's not game over. When you see it on a piece of paper,
Oh no.
that's not the same, because you could get there and there could be a mountain in the way, or you could be standing in the middle of a forest, or the building's ruined, or the building in front of you is taller than you. There's 1,000 things that can make something that looks like
Oh yeah.
archaeoastronomy on paper a world away not true when you get there. But what I did is I showed up and proved that, yeah, it's still happening today.
Like you, when you've spent enough hours on Google Earth and other geodetic mapping programs, you begin to know ancient landscapes intimately from above, zooming in and out, and you get this digital aspect of a landscape. What always shocks me is when I'm in that landscape, looking around, they are two such different worlds that I think perhaps our digital tools often restrict us, because to have gone there and actually witnessed what the people who built the temple specifically to align with witnessed, I've got to question, were you there for the moment, and were there clouds in the way? Did you get a clear day or not?
Oh, I've been there twice now. The first time when I brought 12 people, I brought a film crew, drones, and it rained all the night before, and we were standing on top of that temple with still clouds covering the horizon, and the actual minute passed, and I was just like, oh my God, I've come so far with all these people and all this crew, and we're just going to get nothing. But then, boom, the clouds parted for 2 minutes and gave us the perfect sunrise right on the horizon,
Oh,
and then closed back up. It's like, oh, thank you, whichever Khmer god just smiled down upon me.
yeah.
But that was going to be really ugly. I was going to have to turn around to these, really about 20 people I brought with me and go, well, it did happen. We should come again next year. This last August, perfect sky, got even better pictures.
That was Shiva giving you a wink.
Oh boy, you're in the club now. You've played the game. I kind of love the panic moment before it happens. Like, oh my God, I've come so far. I'm in the middle of nowhere. This has to happen.
I know, and you flew from the States, but Ed, do you know how often in prehistory people must have come from as far afield as Thailand and to, to these temples for these? Here's our chief Zenit temple. The amount of pilgrims that must have traveled so far to get there and to have been screwed by clouds, just like you almost were, that must have been a big part of the ancient world, were these astronomical letdowns, certainly in Scotland. There's amazing archaeoastronomy when you're looking from the maps and whatnot, but I don't know if you could count on one hand the amount of days where there's not fog on the horizon.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's why they make multiple alignments.
Yeah.
Well, the Maya had this one that was 20 days before. There's a big set of alignments that's 20 days before the equinox.
Yeah.
And I bet you they were thinking the exact same thing. Like, okay, we're gonna have a pre-party and then the party. One of them's gonna work out.
Yeah. Google Maps are kind of a delusion because, it's a projected circle around an Earth which isn't actually a globe. And when you use the proper formulas to determine distance between buildings on latitude and longitude, you start to realize that, as you said earlier, exactitude and precision was secondary to perhaps festival, the ceremony, the coming together and the marking of a moment in time. I often think about the bonfires that we have in New Year's in Scotland where whole cities come together and celebrate. I just think that these happen more often in history, and I'd like to ask your perception on this proposition. Considering the propensity of festival, celebration, ritual in history, Do you think that's a lot to do with, or a little to do with, the fact that most people lived until their mid 30s and died, and no longer were we leaving the confusions of childhood and we're facing death? Because if the average age in the prehistoric world, I say prehistoric loosely, certainly up to about 300 years ago, people were dying between 30 and 50, with an elder being 50. That means a lot of people were dying in their teens. How do you think short life might have inspired these buildings and monumental landscapes?
Well, first and foremost, my somewhat unpopular opinion is that that's a falsehood. That people did live to an old age much more than our statistics are flawed. The problem is that back, even 100 years ago, infant mortality was through the roof. So many people did not make it to the age of 5, but we have the skeletal records for them. That infant mortality group has skewed our statistics to make the average seem lower than it actually is.
Oh my goodness.
When I've done a lot of archaeology, and we found a lot of old people, not just kings.
Really?
And what about Miner 49er and all these things? Even in the pioneer days, there was always some old dude sitting there drinking a whiskey in a Colorado mine area. And I think that we need to go back through. We've all been given this assumption that the statistical
Yeah.
average of people in pioneer days or older uh was 30 to 50, because we are if we knocked everybody off the age that didn't make it to the age of 5 off the statistics, we would find that people were living much closer to the ages we're living today. I think at least into their 60s. I mean, gosh, there are so many examples of Maya kings, and of course kings get to live better, sort of. But they're 60, they're 70, they're 80.
Really?
Nobody killed in war dies before 50. So I think that we are victims of faulty statistics that were created by the same people that mismeasured bones and said there were giants. We need to go back through that whole statistical analysis.
Ed, you're really challenging my paradigms today. That's great. I made the proposition on this assumption that people die on average at 35, and then I qualify that by saying that means a lot of people live to 40, 50, but it means a lot of people died at 30 and 20. But you've correct that, because what you're saying is most people died during childbirth and soon after. So that perception of an average in my head is just completely wrong. It's got to be the numbers of infant mortality.
Now, I could be wrong about that, and it's, the task of going back through points of data to try to redo that.
Oh yeah.
I would not. I love math, and I wouldn't do that.
But you found the bones, or inspected the bones of old people in the Mayan world.
So often.
How old can they get?
Pakal was 80.
Oh, wow.
There was a king in I want to say Copan that was in his 80s. A lot of them. I mean, I'd say the majority of kings that I know how old they lived into their mid to late 60s.
Wow.
A lot in the 70s. So yeah, I mean, I don't the answer to your question was that I don't really think about that, because I don't really believe that. I don't think people had shorter to live.
It's great. I've asked this to quite a lot of people, and that's the first time I've had that perspective, and I find it really refreshing. I do. One of your presentations suggested that alignment was important for agricultural success, or crucial for agricultural timing. Well, today we've talked about maybe accuracy wasn't as important to them as we project onto the subject today. Do you think that people stood atop Maya temples, priesthoods or observers, and actually watched these hierophanies, watched these events, and celebrated the turning of the seasons? Or do you think it was just a priesthood that did that, celebrating the actual turn of the seasons on the calendrical key moments?
I think it's the latter. I think that the people came to the festival because it had deep meaning to them, and the priests were celebrating those, those essential moments of harvest, not unlike the ancient people of your homeland. I mean, they, the fall festival was all about the harvest, and yes, it was, people. Here's an important point that I think that is fundamental. People in the ancient times did not have a clock. They did not have a calendar on their wall. They saw the moon and the sun. And so if a large region of people wanted to coordinate to have a party, how were they going to do it? They'd say, "Okay, let's all meet at Newgrange." Well, when? Okay, well, we're going to do it on, on the day that the sun, the couple days that the sun is the farthest south in the sky. And whether you're in Newgrange or whether you're in France, you're going to see the same dang thing. And maybe a group of people in France are going to come up to, to Ireland,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but they can coordinate regional efforts and regional meetings through a unified looking at, on the shorter scale. If you want to go every month, just say, "Hey, let's meet in this cave on the full moon, or the third full moon, we'll see you here again." And you could be thousands of miles apart and see that same moon and say, "Okay, it's 5 days to get there, and in 5 days the moon will be full, so let's get moving." Not only was it coordinating agricultural cycles, but it could coordinate any time that a regional group wanted to get together to meet for whatever purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, there's a question that bears relevance to several of the previous interviews. I've been talking to doctors who study the Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest.
I love Chaco Canyon.
Oh, I wanted you to say that because this is what my question is. After having talked with Dr. Steve Lexon for an hour and a half about the Chaco Meridian, he suggested in 1999 that cultures from the American Southwest extended a prime meridian south into Mesoamerica. That implies that the origins of Mesoamerican architecture came from Chaco Canyon. What do you think about that proposition?
Well, actually, I've just moved into the same community where Steve is. You remind me, I've got to call him and go have a beer with him.
Oh, you're going to say, did that arse on History Fuzz get a hold of you too?
Oh, no, well, maybe so. We might talk about you. I won't say we won't. But in terms of his Chaco Meridian, and I have spoken to Steve about this, so he knows my opinion. When you really do look at it, it is not as perfectly north-south as he wants it to be, and he admits that it is not a perfect fit. But then again, like you were saying, maybe this is the theme of this episode, that age and wisdom temper your belief that if it's not sparklingly accurate, you failed to make your argument. There's wiggle room there. I think that Steve really does have a point. We know from the roads emanating out of Chaco Canyon that they had a very strong drive to create north-south lines. And he is right that all the way down to Paquime, there is a very, very close, but not perfect, because they're not superhumans. They're not aliens. They're real people who screw things up and get close as they can. But to the second part of your thing, did Chaco create Mesoamerican architecture?
Yeah.
No way,
Ah.
because we have too much archaeology. There's, there is a proliferation of culture, architecture, art. It's clear that corn came from Mesoamerica up to Chaco and the ancestral Pueblo people. There's an abundance of archaeology that chronologically makes that impossible.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've got to respond to that, and this will take us to the end of our chat. So, Ed, in our an hour into the chat with Dr. Stephen Lexner, in the most respectful way, I had done my homework and I challenged him on the accuracy of the meridian, demonstrating that the first steps of the meridian vary by like 4 to 6 degrees between Pueblo to Pueblo. But I think with the founding of Aztecs, that is the first effort to establish an astronomer's meridian. Why? Because Aztec site is within a 40-meter variance from the tip of Wilson's Peak.
I hadn't heard that.
And I think because the highest mountain on the northern aspect representing the celestial pole itself, Mount Wilson, Aztec could not be closer to that meridian. And what I suggested to him is perhaps with there being that 4 degree variance in the basket maker 3 manifestation of the meridian, I think you have to accept that that was a purely symbolic, mythological, and emotional alignment rather than a functional astronomer's meridian to the pole. Would you agree?
Totally. With that statement, I would 100% agree that this was not an astronomical exercise. This was a harmonized with the powers that be exercise.
I said to Stephen after it was accepting that those inaccuracies and accepting that it's a deeply symbolic alignment. What it does then is validifies the existence of the alignment and it detracts from the skeptical approach because you're not trying to support it with accuracy. You're trying to support it with cosmological significance.
Well, you've also got a huge piece of archaeology. One of my mantras is, show me the artifacts. It's all well and good for us to talk about an alignment, but do we have any artifactual or physical evidence that they were actually perceiving this line? And in this case, we have a super highway of evidence, literally, where the Great North Road goes from Chaco Canyon up to pointing like an arrow at Aztec, though never making it there because it peters out or we lose it in Coots Canyon. But at some points, it's four parallel roads that each one of them are 30, 40 feet wide. It's literally a 4-lane road perfectly north along the alignment that Steve Lexon talks about. So, I mean, there's the immutable truth that they were paying attention to that line.
And in Colombia, we see it with the ceremonial roads. They terminate often where there isn't a temple. You would expect to see some kind of shrine, but what you do see is that they terminate on what you would call, in general, thresholds, where a landscape changes from dry to wet, from high to low. And I think that's what you just described.
That same thing's happening in Colombia. How exciting! That's I mean that you've just described the whole Chaco Road system.
With this episode, I have a couple of papers that I'll be publishing with this that will highlight some of the things we've talked about. But yes, what I think the most beautiful thing we have here is you'll see 6 pueblos across 40-kilometer stretch, and there's a road that winds and goes round the loch and around the side of a hill. But Ed, you'll see a perfectly straight 40-kilometer road going over along the top of the mountain, cutting through passes and stairs going down glens and coming up the other side with a determination for straightness. And I think they show two things: the trade routes and the social interaction ways, and then roads built with a definite tendency towards straightness above cardinality, above orientation and alignment. The adherence to straightness is just unreal.
Yeah, I've always thought of those kinds of examples as evidence that they had some sort of religious significance. They are not practically made. If you made that road just to haul corn from village A to village B, you'd follow the path of least resistance. You wouldn't bother doing that much work to make it perfectly straight. Same thing with the Chaco roads. I think that and the Chaco roads, one of their mysteries is that there's not much evidence of travel on them. I think that would be explained by only occasional pilgrimage and a connection to religion. One of my colleagues, Bill Fash, said something that I absolutely have always taken to heart and love, and it's just like what you were just saying. He succinctly said, "When you're making something for the gods, it's not supposed to be easy."
That's beautiful, isn't it?
It's profound, isn't it? I mean, just let that sink in for a minute. It really answers a hell of a lot of this. There's always in archaeology, people are always going, "Well, wasn't it impractical for them to do that? Wouldn't they? I mean, doesn't that mean that they were stupid? That they did it such the long way? I mean, where was their efficiency in building this?" Well, it's not supposed to be efficient. They're making it. The harder it is, the greater their reverence, the greater their show of devotion to their cosmology.
Yeah, that is beautiful. And I've seen this example, which you love, is in Peru. There is a stone in the temple of Sacsayhuaman above Cusco, and that the origins of that stone are over 60 kilometers to the southwest. So you've got your New Agers talking about, well, they must have been levitating it, right? You've got the UFO guys who are saying, well, it must have been little green men, but because guess what's impossible for someone to imagine is that 2 or 3 generations of people dedicated their entire existences to getting that stone to the big new temple that's been built because it's our contribution. And I think that's beautiful. 60 years or 80 years maybe to move that big 40-ton boulder. It's beautiful, and it kind of illustrates what you said there in another way.
I think it totally does. That was an act of outrageous devotion.
A devotion unknown about today. Do you know Rob Weiner?
Yes, I do. He studies the gambling among the ancestral pueblo. Yes, I like him.
You've got it. And also he studies the roads. That's what we really talked about. And
Right. He's learning under the master Rich Friedman.
I've got Rich Friedman tomorrow at 4.
Oh man.
Oh man.
That's I when it comes to Rich, I'm not a hard act to follow. He'll blow you out of the water.
I said to you, you are among masters, my friend.
I am honored.
What Rob said to me earlier was that, we discussed how we have tendencies for duality. Black, white, right, wrong, good, bad. But in the past, it was all one interconnected thing.
We see it as dichotomy. They saw it as duality.
On that note, Mr. Ed Barnhart, could you please tell my audience where they can follow you and also make a plea for support?
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. What I'm really doing and I'm passionate about right now is my podcast called ArchaeoEd. It's specifically about the ancient civilizations of the Americas. It's a little bit of a weird spelling, but if like archaeology, ArchaeoEd, it's kind of a double entendre. It's archaeological education, but it's also just me, Ed. So I've been having a lot of fun making that podcast, and I sure could use some help. I love doing this show with you. We're kindred spirits here. I, a lot of the audience is thrilled by aliens and cryptids and ridiculous stories about Atlantis, but you and I are on the same page that we want to make actual history presented in the exciting fashion that we know it is. It's something that people can get around uh, just as well as fantastical stories. We have real stories to tell, and thanks for letting me tell some of mine here.
I can't thank you enough, Ed. What you've done is made the non-spectacular spectacular.
Thank you so much. I guess like a little hierophany, eh?
Yeah, you've got it.
That's Marcello Iliadi's term, hierophany, something the sacred seen in the otherwise profane.
I wish I was cool enough to come up with words like that. I use them now, and I don't always quote her, so people sometimes think it's my word.
You're in the club.
Yeah. Ed, thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, drop a 5-star review or share it with a friend. And you can get in touch with me through historyfuzz.com.